move on to the next session titled Boards, Have They Failed Stakeholders? There's a general concern that boards have not been equal to the task of adequately protecting the interest of stakeholders. Expectations are higher and performance is failing significantly short. What should boards do to remain relevant and add value? Please welcome our panelist, Mr. Mukesh Butani. He's the founder and managing partner of BMR Legal Advocates and a member of the Global Supervisory Board of the International Fiscal Association. He's a specialist in matters relating to trade and investment policy, business reorganizations, cross-border tax structuring, and corporate international tax, with over 30 years of experience. He has several publications to his credit on transfer pricing, tax dispute resolution, and business restructuring, as also on dispute resolution mechanism in Asia. He has been a member of several high-powered committees set up by the Government of India and is regularly engaged with agencies such as the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and Niti Aayog on public policy matters. He has appeared in the Supreme Court of India and several high courts and has deposed as expert witness before foreign arbitral tribunals and courts. Mr. Mukesh Butani. Also, please welcome Ms. Pallavi Shroff. She's the managing partner of Shardul, Amarchand, Mangaldas and Company. She has represented various domestic and international clients before national courts, Supreme Court of India, tribunals and legal institutions, and has earned national and international acclaim. She has handled domestic and international arbitrations under the ICC, the LCIA, and the SIAC. She's an alternate member from India at the ICC Court of Arbitration and formerly a member of the SIAC Governing Board. She was a member of the high-powered Raghavan Committee set up by the Government of India to suggest new competition law regime in India. She has been a member of several other high-powered committees and has been active in public policy-related work. Ms. Pallavi Shroff. And our third panelist is Mr. Damodaran. Our moderator for the session is Mr. Butani. Over to you, sir.
Okay, before you start, I'll make a brief comment. Please. Am I audible? Can you hear me? At the back? Yes. I noticed one hand going up at the back. So if you've seen our brochure, you'll wonder what I'm doing here. Because my name is not Sanjay Nayar. He was expected to be here, but he is in a slightly better climate at this time. He's in Stuttgart, representing the Government of India. And the reason I thought that I could substitute him, not because I have his credentials, is that his surname is Nayar. I belong to a community called Nayar in Kerala. That's the closest that I can get to him, and therefore I thought that maybe I should sit in on this panel. Thank you, Mukesh.
Good afternoon. Just to clarify, the absentee Sanjay Nayar is a Punjabi.
No, that I know. He's Nayar actually.
Nayar.
But
Nayar.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Damodaran, for giving me this opportunity. The topic could not have been more provocative. Boards, have they failed stakeholders? I assume in the Indian context. But one of the reasons the organizers chose two lawyers, because typically lawyers get away with more things than others do. But I just thought I'll add a disclaimer, given the fact that we had some judges, we have civil servants, and I may have some clients, so it's a question of my daily bread as well. That the disclaimer is that whatever I say is in my personal capacity and not meant for as an offense for anyone. Well, since the topic is so provocative, I thought the easiest thing for me to do as a moderator is to ask questions, which is what I'm going to do. We have 4 themes. Mr. Damodaran asked that we leave sufficient time on a topic of this nature for flow participation, so I'm going to do that. But before we get to each of the 4 themes, and we'll try and see how we progress on that, I just thought that when I read some of the research reports, how provocative this could be. This is a very interesting report that I came across. It says that it's been almost 2 decades that the Enron crisis occurred, and as a former Anderson Worldwide partner, I do have memories about how the firm collapsed or the network collapsed in 6 weeks' time, which was because of the Enron crisis for some of you in this room who may remember. But this survey is saying that despite 2 decades of post-Enron regulatory reforms, most boards aren't delivering to their core mission, being providing strong oversight and strategic support for the management. This also supports it with some statistics which are pretty frightening. It says 34% of the 772 directors that were surveyed by McKinsey agreed that boards on which they served comprehend strategies, only 34%. 22% said that boards were completely aware of how their firms created value, as low as 22%, and just 16% more recently in the latest McKinsey study said that out of the 604 C-suite executives and directors that they interviewed across the world, they said that source of the pressure in most organizations was the overemphasis on short-term financial results and underemphasis on long-term value creation. We have a very interesting case study on Boeing. It happens to be a situation where the shareholders have gone and sued the board for misgovernance. We will look at that case study later, but let me try and move on to our first segment. And Pallavi, let me come to you first. There is often this interplay between board responsibility and the day-to-day management, and within the board there is independent directors and executive directors. Often we have come across situations where these lines are getting blurred given the onerous responsibility that is cast on the board. Now, you are a board member as well as a practicing lawyer advising large corporates. Let's start with an overview from your side, and then we'll get on to Mr. Damodran to give his perspective.
So, I think this question is very apt, and quite often when you sit on the board, you see that little resistance from the management trying to push back, particularly with the independent directors, because they know lots of questions are coming on every aspect. But I think this has to be viewed, and sometimes we all forget the heavy duty that is cast on the directors, and in particular the independent directors. First, there is a fiduciary duty. We have to look at the interest of all stakeholders, not only the promoters. India is literally a promoter-driven culture, of business. So we have to look at minority. It's not only the minority, but there are other stakeholders whose interests have to be protected. And that is written in the law. One cannot ignore the law and the mandate of the law. So if you remind yourself of what is the mandate of the law and the extent of responsibility on a director, there will have to be very robust, ensure that there are robust policies, robust processes, and then monitor them. In a number of cases where there have been failures, actually, the blame has come on the board because the board did not do a robust monitoring, either that of a risk committee or of the audit committee didn't go into great depths of the matter, didn't ask the right questions, and let things pass, And sometimes it's just pushed back to a next meeting to deal with. Comes in the action taken report, but again pushed back, investigation is going on, we will come back. So if you view it in the background of the law as it stands today and repeated by number of courts, I think the obligation and the duties on the directors are very, very heavy. And therefore, a management is bound to feel. I'll give you a simple example. An NRC is supposed for the key people or the senior management, it's not even KMPs, but senior management is expected to set the compensation package, the bonuses, performance review, and ESOP policy, and how much ESOP should be given. When it comes to the NRC has to review this in great detail. Management sometimes feel that, look, so far as performance is concerned, how can you judge our performance? But each of these guys have KRAs, all measured objectively against a KRA. So what management feels as an interference, or the CEO sometimes feels that this is my job, who are you to be there? I think is not actually fair to the board by itself, because the board has the obligation to go out and review that. Otherwise, if something were to go wrong, the blame will come on the board itself, or the remuneration committee or whatever issues there are.
Mr. Damodaran, you've been a regulator as well as a board member. Would you agree, disagree, dissent from what Pallavi has said?
No, firstly, I can't disagree with anything that Pallavi says.
No.
Because
I've known Pallavi as a lawyer and as a friend for many decades now. So I'm not disagreeing with that. Let me give another perspective. You did refer to the fact that I have been a regulator, and I like to clarify this, that in close to 78 years on planet Earth, I have spent exactly 3 years in regulation. So therefore, the perspective that I bring is not necessarily a regulator's perspective. That said, I'll tell you where I come from. I have been a member of good boards, I have been a member of bad boards. I have chaired good boards, I have chaired bad boards. I have been on public sector boards, I have been on private sector boards. So you name it, I've been there. And so when I look at this question, have boards failed stakeholders? I think there are two elements that occur to me. One is I have seen a number of directors in boardrooms work exceptionally hard at understanding the subject, analyzing the alternatives, challenging the management, and doing all of what they're expected to do when they're discharging the powers of the board, which is superintendence, direction, and control. And they do that. The perception outside is these guys are going there for tea and biscuits. That's the perception. Now, between the perception that you have and the reality that many people are committing a lot of quality time, there is a huge gap, and that gap needs to, the expectation gap needs to be addressed. As Pallavi mentioned, the liabilities on directors, the independent directors, the expectation, all of that is huge, and yet they are slogging away at it, taking the risk that in public interest you need to give it your best shot, and of course you have to not obstruct decision making, you have to facilitate it, but challenge management as you go on doing that. I think the real issue is the mother question, which is the composition of many boards. So you have good directors on boards, but when you select directors, and we've done this several times in India, maybe even outside, because the expression came from the UK, of flower vase directors that actually make the boardrooms colorful without being a contributory presence in the board. So I love the warning that the mutual fund industry gives us. Past performance is no guarantee of future returns. So you get somebody who in a past life has been brilliant and then expect he or she will perform on the board, forget it, unless you get the right person. If you look at the composition, get the right people on the board, I expect boards will not fail the legitimate expectations of stakeholders. But if stakeholders have unreasonable expectations that this bunch of people sitting in that room will solve all of today's problems and tomorrow's problems, I think we won't get there. The perception issue has to be addressed.
And I agree with what he's saying. Perception is one part. I don't think we have the luxury as independent directors to go and sit and have tea, coffee and come back. That's one. But composition of the boards is very important. And I've seen boards, observed boards, where the so-called independent directors are friends of the promoters and very eminent people, no doubt, but all friends of the promoters. And then when you witness a discussion, you feel, is this the level of discussion this board should have? Perhaps far more rigor should be there in the discussion. So we've seen all of those. And if the right people are not there, and you can be a friend of anybody so long as you are truly independent on the board as an ID, I think that's what makes the difference.
Just to supplement that very briefly, Satyam board had a bunch of extraordinary people.
Exactly.
Right? In the previous lives, they were all very good. But the board failed, and we know that it failed. The Enron board, Enron had two great features. One was, and you've seen Enron fairly close. One was the board had people of exceptional quality. Number two, they had a 64-page code of conduct, which, if you actually subscribe to even 10% of that, Enron would have remained a great company. So I had the opportunity of talking to the very brief conversation with one of the directors on the Enron board, whom I ran into at the JFK airport. So I asked him that, all these SPVs that were being used, when the board members aware of this? He said, no, we weren't given all the details. Then my follow-up question was, but why didn't you ask? But fate intervened. Somebody came and whisked him away saying your flight has been announced. I'm still waiting for the answer. So the question is, great boards, we think well composed, are they doing enough? I wish I could say yes.
Aren't we being too tough? This is 20 years back. A lot has changed. SEBI loader regulations in India, the buddy culture, Pallavi, that you spoke about between independent directors and management. I thought we've come a long way. Or are we saying that we still have a long way to go? Do we see half glass full or half glass empty? That theory still comes into play. Isn't that true?
I think change is always slow. First there has to be a change in the mindset of companies that are typically promoter driven. And I'm not blaming anybody, just the change is very slow. We keep seeing things going wrong, but we always believe, it can't be in my company. And therefore change is much, much slower than I would have liked to see it. There are lots of examples, a number of boards you could see, where it is so centric to the promoter that others may not be allowed to raise their voice. Culturally, and particularly if there are women directors, if you want to raise an issue, will you even be heard? Culturally, it is so male dominated. And when you make a point, the board doesn't like it. And they want to scuttle the whole issue and, push it around the table. I remember in a company, I didn't agree to a very important point, and I actually, at the end of the meeting, I wrote my resignation and kept with me because I know the promoters didn't like it. I said, I don't care, I'm ready to tender my resignation and move on, but I can't do what I don't believe in.
You must have surprised them because you don't wear a jacket, so you couldn't have kept a resignation letter in your pocket.
Carry a big purse. But that's what you do. You have to do what you believe is right.
When I was preparing for this panel, I kept in mind what I said earlier, the short-term goals, quarter-to-quarter performance is what the managements and the boards have been focused on. And I came across this interesting study on Boeing. Some of you would have read it. So for those who aren't aware, in early this year, Boeing shareholders filed a lawsuit against the company's board of directors. They argued that the board neglected a very important oversight responsibility and held the board accountable for safety before and after the crash. So those of you who know, Boeing experienced their 737 MAX airplanes had two tragedies, 2018 and 2019. The plea before the US court simply said safety was no longer a subject matter of board discussion, and there was no mechanism within Boeing by which the safety standards respected the 737, and none was elevated to the board. When you look into the Boeing case study, you come across some very interesting facts, and we can draw parallel with many, many board failures in India, ILFS being prime example and some of the other unlisted company. But the board, the plea pointed out four important aspects. Boeing hired members of high competence and objectivity. So there was nothing lacking in the competence. But there was not even a single board member who had competence in the area of safety and engineering. Instead, they focused on very senior government officials. 4 of the board members were former government officials. One of them was a former White House chief of staff. So there was nothing wrong with the quality of board, except that the competency mapping was not done correctly. The second was the board structure was not aligned with industry need. The question over here is that when you talk about risk management, and I can tell you as having practiced as a chartered accountant for 25 years, people often confuse the role of the chair of the audit committee with the risk committee, and Pallavi and I had very interesting discussions on that, and I wanted to get a lawyer's perspective as well. Coming back to the Boeing case study, there was an audit oversight risk, but there was no risk as such for safety. When you compared that with other airlines, Southwest, JetBlue and Delta, their board committees actually had risk management and safety standards. There are many other aspects that have been pointed out, but one more important aspect was ability to manage truth and realism. The question before the Boeing board always was after the crash, what were they trying to manage? Were they trying to manage truth versus realism? Now this plays out in many which ways in the context of ILFS, but I just wanted, Pallavi, your perspective first on what have you seen the parallels between the Boeing case study and board failures in India?
So, I think ILNFS, is a separate case by itself if you look at it from so many different perspectives. I think the first problem with ILNFS, and just in that context, was the conflicts of interest. For a particular project, you can't be the proposer, the sponsor, the financier, the developer. That in itself brings all the conflicts that you can possibly imagine. Okay? Where what priority took priority at what point of time and discussion, I think became a big issue for them. Secondly, risk management. I think they had a committee which had eminent people on it, but nobody heard. Whatever few meetings they had, I'm told, nobody even heard them. It was, the board would not give it the importance. Apart from the audit committee, I think the risk management committee is the most important committee in the company, because you're not only looking at the existing situation and identifying risks, but you're also identifying risks that are likely to come in the future, given the nature of the business, the industry. Are you producing hazardous inter alia hazardous substances, polymers, whatever you are producing? And is that likely to cause, how focused are you on safety? What are the risks on cyber? I mean, risks today also so many different types. With the internet, the cyber security, cyber risk attacks that you are getting, and there's hardly a big company that hasn't got a cyber attack so far. What are the people risks? What is succession planning? Though succession planning may come at the NRC, it's equally a risk as a part of a risk management committee to say, what is your succession planning at the end of the day? Tomorrow morning, the CEO decides he wants to go. Somebody else is giving him a better deal. Where are you left? Who's your next in line? So all that is part of the risk that is happening. And how well prepared are you for that risk? What mitigation steps are you taking? I think that is very, very critical, which a lot of companies don't focus on. The other, of course, audit committee has financial controls, internal controls, all of which do become quite important, whether you have an internal audit committee or an external auditor who's the internal auditor. I think that, because that's just the financial reporting, the base of the company is its finance. Yeah.
So, Damodar?
You mentioned Boeing, and you referred to the fact that they had nobody there that understood safety well enough. I don't think you need to have a board comprising domain experts in all domains. You don't need that. What you need is people who address the right areas, the right issues, ask the right questions. And then the management is obliged to come up with answers. If you don't know enough, you can always get outside expert opinions. But what happened with Boeing was that nobody thought it was an important enough subject to be addressed. So even if you had a safety expert there, I imagine he or she would have been crowded out of the discussion saying, we have other matters to discuss and this is not going to be important. And as for ILFS, it might interest people here to know that excellent board, as Pallavi mentioned, great people. The risk management committee did not meet for 2 years, if memory serves me right. And I have another problem, and first let me make a personal disclaimer. I do not play golf. I don't get up early enough to play golf, and I'm too lazy to waste a long walk on a game. But where the audit committee chair and the managing director play golf 3 times a week, I worry for the company.
So you've said it all, if you ask me, in that one sentence.
Interestingly, in the Boeing case study, they set up the board committee, separate committee, to address safety issues 6 months after the crash. And the safety issues were reviewed by a separate committee called the Safety Review Board, which was run by the employees but was not accountable to the board. Anyway, disasters do happen. The other learnings from the Boeing case study, and for that matter, it could be, say, any NBFC, which is highly regulated, that runs into deep trouble, is the ability to manage the worst case scenario. Human psychology and research, particularly at the board level, has given rise to a principle called a normalcy bias. A normalcy bias would mean that whenever something goes wrong, 70% of the people enter into a denial phase, particularly at the board level, which is called the normalcy bias. Now, this bias disturbs and interferes with our ability to imagine things as well as to think through how to solve the problem. So, this research also suggests that boards fail because if there is a worst case scenario, and it could be not because of any human intervention, but most boards do not pass this normalcy. I don't know if there are any situations that you would like to talk about from your practical experiences that normalcy bias does enter into the board's mindset and hence intervenes in our ability to deal with worst case scenario situations. Pallavi, you want to go first?
I think the first thing that happens when there is an incident and you raise questions about an incident, the first thing, at least in a good board, I would hope that at least an email comes around informing that this happened in real time as soon as it happens. You don't read about it next day in the newspaper. So that would be my first thing. Secondly, when it happens, I quite often pick up the phone and talk to the CEO to just get a better understanding of what they are doing. Is there something more they can do or not? It's maybe just for my information, but I do that quite often, and I found it very helpful to do that. Because when you sit at the board level, the first is to justify why it happened. It's not my fault. It's not the company's fault. Something else happened. Because when there are so many people around, you will defend yourself. It's human nature. The smallest incident, the biggest incident. Sitting on a board of a company where there was a fire in one part of the factory. So everybody raised questions. It was 2 days before a board meeting. So everybody raised. Instantly, the CEO was on his back, He said, no, I took this, I did this, but acknowledge there was a fire, acknowledge somebody was injured. And now, then what next? So after the first discussion, we changed everything and said, okay, first item on the agenda is safety report. It's a manufacturing company, bring a safety report first. If there's any incident, what steps have they taken, how have they taken, what they are doing, what expert was brought in, all of that. And suddenly we saw change in the culture because there were some one-on-one conversations. The CEO was not literally pilloried, Also, I think when you look at performance, the MD is responsible for the performance of the financial performance of the company. The culture today, because of the investors in most company, and PE investors in particular, I would say, we need them, but the approach is short term. They want to exit in 3 to 5 years, so they want to see performance and increase in valuations. Which means the CEO has to perform quarter on quarter. If he doesn't perform, the analysts and the market will just butcher the company. Prices will start dropping. The CEO is literally, abused and saying he's not competent, he's not there, which I think is very unfair. There will be quarters when the outstanding performance, immediately followed by a quarter which may not have that. There are seasons, cyclical, companies that go through the whole cycle, and festivals come, something or the other happens, and or an incident has happened, some policy has changed. But if you want to see only short term, then you will have incidents like Boeing, where the focus is only on the return to investors or to everybody, make money, create wealth, but the long term sustainability. And I think I put safety in that whole bucket of long term sustainability, which you will not see.
Mr. Damodaran, the example that Pallavi gave of the fire and similar other examples, how is the board or independent directors supposed to be held responsible for these instances? I mean, aren't these routine day-to-day management, going back to our first segment, that how can managements be held responsible for situations of this nature?
I think the real issue is information flow. If something like a fire accident happens, how quickly are board members informed? Do you, as she said, do you wait for the next board meeting, the next committee meeting? And some companies do that. They don't have a system where between board meetings, you keep the manager, the board members informed. So information flow, and this is a failing of the board, because you have not just a right, but a duty to ask for relevant information and see that you get enough of it at the right time. And what do some imaginative managements do? You ask for information, they'll give you a ton of stuff, 90% of which is either irrelevant or non-actionable, right? So, I mean, I know there might be a few people here from the IT industry, but the IT industry has confused all of us by equating, information and data. All data is not information. It's only actionable data which I need to get. I don't need to get to know several other things. But if you ask for information, make a nuisance of yourself, they know how to deal with it. They'll dump you with stuff. No board notes will be short. There will be no executive summaries. There will be complex sentences where you can say things in simple sentences, and they will completely confuse you. And going back to the normalcy bias, I explain it in terms of a 3D syndrome: deny, defy, and decry. So if people follow that practice, you will never get anywhere. First, deny there's a problem. Yeah. And if somebody says, no, there's a problem, this is what you should do, then defy that. And if nothing works, go outside the boardroom and say the guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Yeah. It's perfect. Yeah.
In a lighter vein, on your...
human nature.
It is.
That's human nature.
Unfortunately, it shouldn't get to the boardroom.
Yeah. I agree. I agree. But 10 people sitting there, the CEO is being asked by one by all of them.
Yes, yes.
The poor guy's as it is with his back to the wall, and doesn't know if he says something, somebody else is going to ask another question. So he says, it's one off, never happens again, never happened in the past. You hear all those
But good
stories.
CEOs know how to handle that.
Correct.
If you ask 10 questions, they'll pick the 2 easier ones and give very elaborate replies to those.
Agreed.
In a lighter vein, I recently had an experience where I was invited to join the stakeholder committee of a board. And my first stakeholder committee meeting had attachments, thanks to technology, which had 5,000 pages. And I must confess, I look at those papers 24 to 12 hours before the board meeting, but I read them thoroughly. I wanted to say that. And I realized those 5,000 pages contained lost share certificates, affidavits, Aadhaar cards, everything. And when I asked the company secretary, he said, sir, this is the practice we follow. So I said, you please discontinue this practice. They said, I have to discuss this with the board to discontinue the practice. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you. Let's come to another.
I have to admit that in some discussions that I've had with Mr. Damodar, when you're talking of stakeholders committee, the typical stakeholders committee, because it's a SEBI requirement, will talk of the shareholders, who are the principal shareholders, who are the PEs, what is the composition of the cap table, and the usual things that we see. Are there any grievances, no grievances? We are all very happy. But I think Mr. Damodaran, in one of my discussions with him, has raised a very important point. Why are there are so many stakeholders in a company, why don't we ever discuss about other stakeholders? And I thought the thought was a really good thought, and how to go about implementing it, getting the information, and to what extent one can go into some of the other stakeholders is as important, you know.
Just to supplement that, two things. One of the major failures in the Companies Act 2013 is that having in grand fashion renamed the Shareholder Grievance Committee as a Stakeholder Relationship Committee,
Correct.
giving rise to expectations derived from the name, you said it will look after matters relating to the holders of securities. You didn't expand the universe. And there are a bunch of stakeholders outside which have no board committees looking at them. And you could certainly have addressed that.
Correct.
The second is, this is a matter that Pallavi is very familiar with. One of our major Bangalore-based IT companies which had an issue, a standoff between the founders and the management. The founder wrote to the company, nothing much happened. Therefore, he went to the newspapers, right? What did the management do? They engaged a law firm to address that. And there was a stakeholder relationship committee, which was, I always compare this to, supporting actors or extras, as they were once upon a time called in movies.
Yes.
At least those chaps got some lines of dialogue once in a while. The stakeholder relationship committee was completely out of the picture, while the founder and the management was engaging, one through newspapers, the other through a law firm.
Right. Yeah.
So I think that committee needs to reinvent itself, give itself a little more.
I entirely agree. I think
Time allocated typically in any board.
15 minutes.
15 minutes, exactly.
15 minutes is the time.
It's a
15 is
5-page
liberal.
presentation,
Yeah.
15 minutes,
Yeah.
and that's it.
15 is liberal, and
Yeah.
sometimes 5 minutes.
Will it be fair to say that if there are two committees which play a pivotal role in any board and terribly underestimated, underprovided from the timing point of view are stakeholder committee and risk management committee? I wanted to come to the risk management committee debate separately, but I don't know if both of you agree with that.
I would agree. Risk
True,
management
that's
is
another
underplayed.
failure of the Companies Act, that when you mandated 4 companies, board committees, you didn't mandate the risk committee, which was very important in 2013 as it is now.
Correct.
It was left to SEBI, God bless them, to actually suggest that companies should have risk management committees. The Companies Act still doesn't
Yeah.
have
And
that.
one area where I could never figure out the regulatory move was if the audit committee has to be chaired by an independent, why not the risk committee? But anyway, that's debated for another day. Let's move on with the theme on why do boards fail stakeholders. From the situation of inability to manage disasters, we now look at what we call it as early red flags. And again, looking at the Indian corporate governance scenario, there are many instances, many signs of red flags. Some of them that I was able to pick up based on my reading was staggered information flow, defensive approach of the CEO in board meetings, frequent resignations of CFO or compliance officers, whistleblower complaints, spikes in certain expenses, and related party transactions spike. So these were one class of instances which could potentially lead to board failure because these red flags were not identified. Then there were a set of qualitative.
Would you like to add one more? Sometimes the regulator raises issues which are not perceived in the way in which they should be perceived. It's normal replies just go out without understanding what's really the issue there. And I think that is an early warning when the regulator, even a request for information by the regulator is a warning sign.
That is where the 3D phenomenon kicks in.
Yeah.
Correct. We also identified that there were some other qualitative factors which were resulting in boards missing out on these red alerts. Board composition, you mentioned that point, sir.
Correct.
Inadequate technical or industry expertise on the board. Failure to select the right CEO. Overemphasis of the management on quarterly performance. Inadequate discussions on long-term strategy and visioning. Inadequate time devoted to voluminous reports and documents which accompany the board agenda. This, in my view, sums up mostly 8 of the 10. If large corporates who believe in good governance practices are able to pick up these red flags, you can prevent a board failure. Your comment.
So, Mukesh, I think a number of companies I'm seeing now, their board meetings are not just one-day meetings, they are two-day meetings, you know. And one day will be the committees, because you need time in audit, you need time for the risk management and all. So that is just one day of just committee meetings. And then there is a discussion, there's the whole board meeting, because there the overemphasis on numbers, budget, are you meeting your AOPs, and just that's the only focus effectively. What is your ComSet doing, whether you're meeting the same, are you online, are you not? It's just a numbers discussion at the end of the day. And then after the numbers game is over, they start discussing the strategy. So that is now becoming a trend in more than one company. And wherever it is not, at least where I have an ability to say, I say, look, can we split the two? Because it's good to monitor what the competitors are doing, where is your sustainability, what are you doing, how are you going to move forward. I think that strategic vision, which first the promoter has to share, after which I think the board members, all the board members can effectively add to it, challenge, and have a more robust discussion. But that is very critical, at least on a strategic level, to take stock once a quarter, maybe once in 6 months, that's also fine. And a more holistic meeting once a year, I think is quite critical if you ask me. And a number of boards have started doing that, you know, to have those discussions. But board meetings are no longer one-day meetings.
There's one other thought that I wanted to share, which somehow does not get enough attention, which is that the workload of the committees is not evenly distributed among the directors. In many companies, there are directors, and I think we have a graph which is playing out somewhere outside, part of our survey, annual survey, which we bring out in December. It will come out, but we extracted 5 or 6 of those and just put it out. It says there are companies where there are directors who are not on any committees. There are directors who are on all 5 committees, including the risk management committee. Now, information asymmetry among directors is one of the major problems that boards have, because I'm not saying everyone should have identical information, but if there is such a huge gap in information, because most work gets transacted in committees, boards have no time to dig deep, right? And there are people who are not on committees. How are they part of the conversation in the board when some things get discussed? They can't be. So I think that information asymmetry issue has to be tackled if the board is to function properly.
Yeah, I think what you also said earlier, the flow of information.
Yes.
I think that becomes very critical. How much of information is the company willing to share, relevant information, not data, information. How much information is the company willing to share as part of the board agenda that helps you understand the issue, the situation, and take a very informed decision.
Absolutely.
Let's come to the last segment. I'm just mindful of time. I wanted quick response. The 4th element is failure of committees that result in failure of boards. I know we had some discussion in the context of stakeholder committee, but there are 2 other committees which are equally critical. One is the risk committee and the importance. We concluded that the risk committee is understated in terms of its importance, at least in Indian boards. Second is the role of the nomination and remuneration committee. In particular, the role the nomination and remuneration committee plays with regard to the CEOs. I just came across a very interesting global survey which talks about 5 top mistakes in choosing the wrong CEO. And I felt that they were equally true in the context of India as well. 1, companies not grooming successors within the company, an insider. 2, companies often choosing company successor who pledges to lead the business in the same manner as his predecessor. In all probability, The person who's going out has chosen the person who's going to succeed him. 3, business allows the current CEO to dominate the hiring process, an extension of the second. 4th, company chooses an outsider without regard to the strong culture, and the new CEO is a cultural misfit. And 5th, the board does not give the CEO, the new CEO, a clear mandate. These are the 5 things which are responsible. What has been your experiences in the board or in the nomination and remuneration committee on CEO successions? Because the failure of the CEO is the failure of the board, isn't it?
I think there's a bit of awareness that they need to do some succession planning. A number of boards now started looking at it, and particularly at the senior KMP level, is there somebody in the company? If there's not someone in the company, is there somebody else who they have their eye on? They may not talk to such a person, but so-and-so would be a good fit. I think given the role of the NRC, probably the NRC does play a key role now. At least in listed companies, the NRC will play a key role in selecting a good CEO. And I think selecting the right CEO with the right fit for the company makes all the difference. Sometimes as board members, we get enamored maybe by saying, oh my God, he's such a good past performance on sales, something so good. But what else has that happened? Has there been, what is the diversity ratio and what is the diversity index I would put for that CEO? Nobody would look at typically. Apart from sales and profit, do we look at other issues? And I think that becomes quite important. But when my own experience is when NRC looks at something, I think it certainly takes its time, and there are more eyes than one and more brains than one looking at it, so each one trying to look at a different aspect. And conversations become very important, formal and informal conversations.
Mr. Damodaran, your experience on the effectiveness and efficacy of NRC?
Okay. Let me make a confessional statement. You know, I told you I've been on a number of boards. They kept me out of the NRC in nearly every board. The only NRC where I was, for whatever reason, the only NRC where I'm a member of the board is where Pallavi chairs the NRC. Right. So I must make that disclosure. But that said, when you talk in terms of succession, this business of an inside candidate versus an outside candidate, I always have felt that the question which is asked is this next person good enough? You don't ask, who is the best to replace this guy? Which means looking outside in a serious fashion. It's only when you fail to find somebody measuring up, you start looking outside. Shouldn't we get the best by looking outside the company? Is a thought that I have felt, and succession planning is very, very important.
All right, we now move on to the Q&A session and floor participation. I think there's a gentleman here, his hand is up. Please direct your question to whoever you want him to answer.
Damodaran, I have a question.
Yes, yes, Mr. Sandalia.
Mr. Damodaran,
There's a question.
There's a question for you. Mr.
I'm here on the Sanjay.
Mr. Sandalia, on your left, sir.
Acha, Mr. Sandilya, give me 10 seconds. I will try and anticipate your question meanwhile. Yes,
I have
please.
exactly the same opinion on the stakeholders committee. The Companies Act changed the name, but it did not change the rate. They said it's only security holders. Why is it that the Companies Act has not changed it? Because there are so many stakeholders for the company. Very, very narrow scope is only security holders. Why hasn't the Companies Act changed it?
Let me give you a very broad-based answer to your question. After the Companies Act 2013 came into being, I was invited to speak at some function. So I carried with me a copy of the 1956 Act and a copy of the 2013 Act. Not that I wanted to read it out to anybody, but I kept both of those there while I was speaking. And I said that the 2013 Act has done us a great favor. It has made the 1956 Act look good. That is what it has done, right? Because there has been a lot of tinkering, but the essentials didn't get addressed. The few things got done, some we copied. In fact, I have been asked sometimes, my friends from the US are in the audience, so they will appreciate this. I was asked once at a function here in Delhi, John Thain had come at that time, and we were both addressing a bunch of guys. And somebody asked that, is it true that Indian regulators blindly copy the US regulators? I said, that's completely untrue. We copy with open eyes. Not that we copy blindly. We take what is relevant. We don't take what is not relevant. The point is that when you look at the 2013 Act, what it has done is picked a few things. So the US has class action suit, we will have class action suit. What has happened to class action suit? How many have you found in India so far?
None.
Even the Satyam, ADR holders filed against the audit committee in the United States. There was no provision available to them in India for the Indian shareholders to go after the management of Satyam. So I think it's a failure of whoever drafted it and put it through the parliamentary committees. As I mentioned, you give it a name, Stakeholder Relationship Committee. You're not taking the term stakeholder seriously because you're saying in the operative portion, holders of securities. You're talking about relationship. Where is the relationship? You're playing black pieces. If somebody writes to you, you respond. You're not reaching out to somebody. Committees will, of course, remain committees. As Pallavi mentioned, and we've had this conversation earlier, we have to broad base what this does. And my approach to all laws is this. There is something that the law prescribes. You have no choice. You have to do it. There is something that the law proscribes. You have no choice. You shouldn't be doing that. In between, there is a whole lot that you can do because you're not violating law. And the Stakeholder Relationship Committee expanding its remit comes in that intermediate space. No law prevents you. I've been asked this sometimes in some companies. But where is the legal provision that we can look at it? So my question is, where is the legal provision that you can't look at it? What prevents you from looking at it? I think that needs to be expanded. Otherwise, we won't get anywhere.
I think a gradual expansion of that is what is called for. So the companies can do a good job of whichever one by one they can add the
handful
stakeholder.
of committees have.
Correct.
I am the culprit. I forced some of them, but the rest have not expanded. I think Mr. Sethi had something, Mr. Subramaniam had something, Mr. Thomas Matthew. My eyes are also on the clock. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
One question I was wanting to ask Mr. Sanjay has addressed. The second, it came up in the previous session also. You talk about private equity and VCs asking for valuation, exit route. What prevents them from looking at governance issues? There's absolutely no discipline among the PE investors except to look for valuation. How do we bring it about?
No,
Sir,
let me.
I
Sorry,
agree
you go
with
ahead.
him.
You go ahead.
My few experiences dealing with the PE world and governance, I tend to agree with him. There was a time when PE funds came in, invested. At the end of 2 years, they want to exit 3 years. As soon as 3 years over, they want a higher valuation. So long as the valuations keep increasing, and according to me, very artificially, these valuations kept increasing on no accounting criteria, if I can put it. And they were happy to exit and move on. Somebody else came in. And I knew of, in certain companies, investors have 600, 700 million, 3 or 4 of them have $1 billion. And nobody is bothered whether there are real meetings. These are all startups, whether they're real meetings, they're paper meetings, there's no CFO. I said, how the hell are you attending board meetings? Where are you not worried about what's happening to your money? Suddenly when there's a crisis, they all get up and then they want calls at 6 in the morning and saying, what happened now, we have to take action. But what were you doing for 4 years, 5 years?
No, you might remember that 2 years ago at this same summit, we had a session called Values and Valuation. So these guys who are in search of higher valuations abandon values in the process. They don't have good enough due diligence. We assume that these are very sophisticated investors, they will do due diligence, nothing of the kind. They're looking at, as Pallavi said, when do I exit? At what valuation do I exit, period. That's all that they're looking at, unfortunately. And you've had several big investors who have played this game, unfortunately. You look at every big failure in India, who are the guys who've invested? Some of the top-notch companies which should have known better and kept staying on this. I think the real issue is that those that write out the checks must know how that money is being applied. If they don't do it, it's a huge failure on their part. But there are guys with deep pockets sitting there who are giving them more money to invest in the same companies. That is the whole problem. Yeah.
Sir,
There are many questions here. Yeah, please go ahead, please.
sir, we had the inaugural session on the regulators, and the recent years we find that there is a tendency of regulators pushing more and more accountability on the board and on the audit committee. Is it right? Should it not be more on the management who have the full information and the responsibility for compliance and performance?
No, I think they're all looking at me because I used to be a regulator for 3 years, many decades ago. You heard this morning, at least two of them say that they are not believers. I hope it is their institutional view, not their individual view, that they're not believers in writing more regulations, but in better enforcement and better regulation. Now, the real point is this, that you tell this to a regulator and they will point to some failures and say that, we need to address these. Unfortunately, regulation, not just in India, it's not an Indian phenomenon. Post 2008 in the financial sector in several jurisdictions, you had knee-jerk reactions. Somebody misconducted himself, you wrote a new regulation instead of fixing the problem. I'm fond of saying this. Earlier we said, give me a problem, I'll give you a solution. Now we say, give me a problem, I'll write you a regulation. That is how the world has moved on. No, I think also we hear talk sometimes about soft touch regulation. There's nothing called soft touch regulation. Either there's regulation or there's no regulation. Soft touch is imaginary. It doesn't work in the regulatory space. There will be more prescriptions, but they need to review them to see what is contextually irrelevant with the world having moved on. That's not happening. I'm a great believer in sunset clauses in regulation. I'm a great believer in having a regulatory review authority to clean all the stock element of the outdated regulations. If that doesn't happen, we'll get more and more regulations, much of which doesn't make sense and it cramps initiative. You're overloaded. I'll give you an example. There are bankers here. I think Ajay is here. I can see him. The Reserve Bank of India, at one stage, when they got a lot of criticism that there were too many things that they had mandated should be looked at by the board. There were 67 at that point of time. They did a study and after 18 months reduced it to 63 from 67, right? So they removed 4 somewhere in the margin. I'm speaking to some bankers now, they're telling me that's outdated. Now we are looking at 80 plus because of all what has been added later. So I think that expectation that the board will look at everything, do a deep dive. In fact, when I was on the Bank of Baroda many decades ago, we had a very fine gentleman from the political space, Chief Executive Councillor of Delhi in 1957 or something, that kind of vintage, right? So we had all these board papers on the table and he asked the chairman in all innocence, are we supposed to read all of this and come on? Why are these papers kept here? It's come to that. If you go in for overkill, the board will say, somebody referred to it briefly, he was pinching one of the lines I raised, if regulators raise the bar, you can either attempt to jump over it, you may fail, or you can walk happily under it, which is what most people are doing.
Sir, but let me put it the other way around. A regulator, from a regulator's point of view, for him his authority and his power is very important. So anything that undermines his power or he feels that his power is going away, he will resist, the regulator will resist. That is why sometimes two regulators will clash over the same issue whose jurisdiction it is.
Yeah,
So
turf
that
battles.
Turf battles plus keeping the power to themselves becomes very important. Sometimes I wonder, we all talk of over-regulation, and I'm agreeing that there is over-regulation. But if we didn't have this prescriptive over-regulation, see, we are at a stage where we are still trying to change or bring about governance, you know. Left to themselves, I am not sure how many times, how many businesses will actually voluntarily want to shift to better governance, because there is a cost of governance also, and it takes far more effort and do a lot many things than businesses feel their priorities are somewhere else in business
I
itself.
wanted to make a brief comment, which I should have made in the first session, but I didn't do it deliberately because there were regulators on stage.
If there was
There-
no regulation, what would
There
I
are a
mean?
few posts which are falling vacant, regulatory posts, insurance, securities, etc. I think one of the essential conditions should be, it should be a person with a heart. You forget other qualifications. A person with a heart should be there. If it's a person doesn't have a heart, he or she shouldn't be in the short list for consideration.
Can I ask my question now?
Yeah,
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
Deepak Sethi here. I'm a consultant and a thinking productivity coach. The session is boards, have they failed stakeholders? And I think this is a flagship issue which, you know, features in all the events that Mr. Damodaran holds. And in this context, my question is that my take on this very key question, and I think the consensus amidst most of us, including the people on the stage, is that yes, by and large, the boards have failed. So the question is why? And that brings me to 2 or 3 things that I feel are the key reasons amongst the multitude of reasons. Reason number 1, buddy culture. And reason number 2, self-interest trumps the role assigned to you. And the third one is an alignment of what the real board's role is between the promoter and the board, particularly bought into by promoter. Now, I'm saying this because basically boards fail because the right conversations are not taking place, and these are the reasons for it. My question to all of you people is that would you agree with, you know, these 3 being the key factors per se? And if so, then what can be done about it? And if there is a 4th factor, I'll be happy to hear that also.
I'll attempt a short answer. I agree.
Pallavi?
I think boards fail, and there's some boards fail, some don't. They fail at some points of time, but not at all points of time. So the answer is both yes and no. Boards also make mistakes. So I don't think we can say that boards don't fail or boards only fail. There are a number of factors that we've all discussed today. What can be done better is all of us need to be, who are sitting as directors, need to be far more conscious of the role that we are expected to play. And as I says, we understand our role well when we get onto a board. I think we just need to be careful, play our role well enough. And the biggest change that I would want is for promoters to accept the role of the board. And that is the change, mindset change that I've been talking about.
Keeping gender diversity in mind, I just thought we
have
have
to
one
ask
more last
her.
question to the lady, but there is
Oh,
a
yes. No, no,
there could be a conflict, so I'm just disclosing she's a colleague. Yes, Seema, go ahead.
I have this question as a young professional and somebody looking at joining boards in the future. And for me, if I were on a board, there are these 3 things, and I want to ask you all, how much does this play out? Before I'm joining a board, I want to know what is the vision of the promoter. What is he building the company for? Is he building something that is to grow and last for perpetuity? Does he have expansion in mind, or does he have an acquisition in mind? Because, you know, this would kind of determine the rigor I'm employing as I'm asking questions, understanding the operations of the company. So I don't know how much does that play out in a board. The second one that I would worry about is the culture of the company. which is, and so I don't know how much culture sensitization happens when a new director is inducted, because some companies could inherently be very promoter driven, very yes culture. Some could be very marketing focused, where the marketing people are calling all the shots. Some could just be very process driven, where nobody questions the process. And if I do not understand that, I may not be able to ask the right questions. So how much of does that really happen when a new director is inducted on the board? And my last question is, how much emphasis is on legal and professional fees? Because for me, that is one very important criteria which shows me where this company is headed. So, spike in legal fees means something is going wrong. Professional fees paid to B-grade professional, C-grade professional seems to indicate that, there is something happening which they do not want to approach the good professionals for. So I just wanted to understand that, are all of these things really important, or am I being too idealistic in expecting all of this while I become a board member?
I'll take the first question. Promoters. I think one of our failures has been that we've distrusted promoters. We think every promoter is a crook. It's not true. We should shift our approach from, our approach ought to be trust but verify, not distrust and crucify. We are now on the distrust and crucify thing. Every guy is a crook. Let's get after him. The government is taking great credit for decriminalizing a number of sections in the Companies Act. Why were they made criminal offenses in the first instance? Because our entire thinking was these guys are a bunch of crooks up to no good, and therefore we got to go after them. Without that, there's no way that can happen. I'll leave the other questions to Pallavi.
I think if you are asked to join a board, you do have the ability to have conversations with the promoters and one or two other people to find out more details. There's of course public information that you will get from the balance sheets, and when you read their CSR reports and other things, you will get a lot of information about the company. What are the plans, growth plans or other plans for the company, and how do they go about that? These are all conversations you can have with the promoter before saying yes or no to this thing. Secondly, what is the true culture of the company? Promoter will tell you whatever he wants to tell you. Once you're on the board, in your first meeting, you will understand what the real culture is. There is no, shortcut to that. And whether they're doing enough for their employees and all, that is a question again you can ask. Their annual balance sheets will tell you if they're doing anything. How important is learning and development?
I want to make a point on culture. She raised a point on culture, which is that you're aware of the famous statement of Peter Drucker, no less, who said that culture eats strategy for lunch. So I'm looking at the clock, it's time for lunch.
Absolutely.
So we should all play Peter Drucker at this stage.
So before I thank our panelists and we close this session, there was a fifth learning from the Boeing case study. It says practice accountability and punish the wrongdoing. Why did the researchers make this statement? The CEO kept on insisting after the accidents that he's going to fix the software issue, he's going to have better training. His chairman kept on backing him up. On the 5th of November 2019, the chairman said, Mr. CEO has done everything right. After 6 weeks, the CEO resigned, but with a severance package of $80 million. So on that note, thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Mr. Butani, Ms. Shroff, and Mr. Damodaran for giving us such deep insights into the topic. May I now request Air Chief Marshal Dhanoa to please present a memento to each panelist. On behalf of each panelist, Excellence Enablers is proud to have sponsored education for one girl child for 1 full year through the NGO Nanni Kali, a Mahendra initiative. Once again, thank you all the panelists and thank you Air Chief Marshal Dhanoa for doing the honors.